Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. Hi, I'm Patty, and I'm the teacher blogger behind Madly Learning, and I come to you live every single week to talk about using inquiry-based teaching strategies in your classroom, hopefully helping you out so that you can implement inquiry in your classroom and make it fun and engaging and take out some of the stress that sometimes might happen when you try something new. Tonight, we're going to be talking about a flipped classroom, and I'm using some of the strategies from traditional flipped classrooms where students might watch a lesson at home and then come into class and do the work and the practice. We're going to change that a little because in reality, if you're an elementary teacher, you probably don't have students that have the ability or skills or time to be watching all of those videos at home. So instead, you can use different strategies so that you can use a flipped classroom type model all within your room at the same time. So I'm going to be talking about how that's been going in my classroom and what I've been doing, and I will be answering any questions that you might have about using a flipped classroom. Now, a flipped classroom traditionally is when you would assign a lesson or video content to students prior to them coming in class. So I think the most widely held usage for this is often in high school, where you might give students an assignment or a video to watch prior to class beginning, and then during class time, instead of a lecture happening, it's time to practice and meet with the teacher consulting. Well, that can all happen in a flipped elementary classroom, except you can do that all during the learning period. So to get started, this is a great way for you to get your feet wet and get started at transitioning from a traditional teaching method to a more inquiry-based teaching method, because it does change when you're doing a lot of instruction and you are giving up a little bit of control, but still in a more controlled way. So it's a great way to get started if you are somebody who's just new and beginning to get started and wants to use more inquiry in the classroom but isn't sure where to start. Starting with a flipped classroom is a great way to do that. So in an elementary classroom, you are going to give a flipped learning model. I use centers and use, especially in math, having learning centers for that is really great. Now, I've been experimenting over the last few weeks with using this model, doing guided math centers in my room. And this kind of came about because if you have ever taught 9 to 11-year-olds how to use a protractor, you can probably empathize with me about just how tedious and tough that is. So I was really struggling with, I can't do another whole class protractor lesson where everyone stares at me with bug eyes and goes, "You just did what?" So I wanted a way to be able to sit with my students and walk them through the process of how to use a protractor. So after speaking to some of my teacher friends who have used guided math in their rooms, I thought, well, maybe this would be a good application to start with guided math. So I thought about using the acronym MATH, M-A-T-H, and used a lot of the ideas of what kind of centers you can get. So I have 4 centers. The 2 I'm going to be talking about are the ones that the first one uses technology and the second one is meet with the teacher. The other 2 are math on your own, so it's just standard math practice, as well as hands-on, either playing games or using manipulatives so that students can apply their learning. But the 2 I'm going to be talking about tonight are the using technology and then meeting with the teacher. Now, in this flipped classroom, instead of front-loading all of your information for your students, I instead give a learning goal as to what it is I want them to know, and then I back right off and let them try to learn and teach some of that to themselves before they meet with me. So that's kind of the caveat, is I'm not giving a lot of front-loaded information. I am backloading a lot more information. So after they've learned, they then meet with me and we talk about it. But I'm not sitting with my students and going over all of the things they need to learn and pre-teaching any type of lesson for this. So I've done this with geometry and using a protractor, and I'm also starting to do this with my current unit, which is fractions. And I'm doing this because my students really liked this learning method and they asked me to continue it. So being that I try to be as responsive as possible to student voice and choice, even though it might be a bit more comfortable for me for this circumstance, I did think I was going to give it a try. So for my time with technology, students go ahead and I pre-plan a quiz and give them access to resources. So I'm just going to show you an example of what I've done. So students will log into their Google Classroom and they get a link to this form. So this is about identifying the triangle. Now I have pre-created this. Now one of the things that I really like about this is that I can come up with the different questions that are on there for students to go through. So the first little bit is background. And this is an example of what you would see as a student. So you can answer the questions about the triangles here and labeling different types of triangles. And it's just pure definitions. Then when you click next, show you what it looks like on the teacher side here. You can go down to the second section is where I've had them, that we have iPads in our classroom like I talked about last week. But in section number 2, I actually have them drawing a triangle on a piece of paper. Now, the best part about Google Forms is you can prompt them to actually take a photo of what they've drawn and add it into the quiz and then answer subsequent questions about the triangle that they drew. So I found this really handy, and this is a quick assessment. The best part is this marks it for you. So there's no marking that you actually have to do because it's all in the Google form. The only thing you might need to check is the fact that the triangle that they drew is appropriate and that they might not be cheating off of somebody else. But in this circumstance, they can see that. And you'll see that I have 9 responses for this quiz. So drawing the triangle, again, I gave them the questions and then they had to take a photo of the triangle that they drew based on the clues that I gave them and then answer some questions. Now, this also proceeded before they did this activity. I also linked them to a few videos, some that can be included as a Khan Academy is a great resource, as well as many of the YouTube videos. And this was all hosted for them with all of the links in the Google Classroom so that they can then, so this is all in my Google Classroom so that students can work through the activities and follow it up with a quiz. Now, this is all before they meet with me. Once they meet with me, then I can kind of see what they've learned. It's really a time for us to talk about their math and what it is that they're learning and what they learned from watching those videos. We can have a math talk about that. And I can see what they struggled with and we can address that more on an individual basis because we're talking about triangles and they can ask me questions and we can meet and we can brainstorm and problem solve the different issues that they encountered when they were doing the quiz. I found that I was quickly able to get through what it is they needed and I didn't have to necessarily worry about all 20 students figuring out where they needed. I could be more responsive to individual needs when I met with them in small groups after they had had a time to watch a tutorial video. So I found that we were actually able to move through different learning concepts much quicker this way, and they had a much deeper understanding of what it is I was asking them to do. So for instance, I'll flip over to show you this week's. This is identifying fractions that they're working on right now. So you'll see I have a few responses that have already come in. And they have to go through and answer these questions. And I can also embed, you'll see in section 2 of the quiz, I can actually embed the video itself right into the quiz that they can then watch and then apply what they learned in that to answer some of the questions. I find that if I just put a question, sorry, if I just put a video, sometimes they don't focus on the most important parts. But if I put questions that follow up and have them apply some of the concepts that they learned in the video, they can then go and look for key lessons from that video. It also helps to hold them a little bit accountable for that as well. And I found there to be a lot of great success with this strategy. And I'm finding again that we're able to work through a few steps at a different rate. I also really like using the videos because it allows students to stop, pause, and replay, as well as because it's all hosted in our Google Classroom, they can access this at any point in time when they are at home, if they need some review or if they need to go back and look at it throughout the week, they can. So although we do use centers, I am trying to move them away from a very structured center rotation into a more student-led open learning type structure rotation where they have the 4 activities to go to, but the order in which they choose to go to those might be a little bit different. But I'll definitely tell you how that works out after I've had some time to practice that myself. Another way that you can use a flipped classroom is, say, in science. So I'll just get this off here. In science, when you have a flipped classroom, you think of it as you are giving them the success criteria and the learning goals, and then you are sending them off to find the answers to those questions, and then they bring it back and you share your learning and knowledge. So instead of you as the teacher front-loading all of that information and walk them through that step by step and then testing them at the end, you instead are giving them the criteria that you're going to be assessing them on and then having them find the answers to those questions and then talking about it. So that's why it's a flipped, because it is reversed what you would normally say is a traditional teaching methodology. So if you think about what it could look like in science. So for example, we're doing energy and sources of energy right now in my classroom. So think about what that could look like. For my students, we actually went on a school trip to an ecologically friendly house, and they introduced them at a surface level to all of the different aspects of being more energy conscious and conserving energy and why we should do that. From there, students got a very preview sense of the different sources of energy, but they didn't really understand how those sources produced energy. So that is something that we need to dig deeper and look more into. So once we came back from that field trip and we could reflect on what it was that we learned that there's a whole bunch of different sources of energy, but we didn't really know very much about them. So I gave them the option of how it was that we were going to dive deep and learn more about that information. So we looked at, did they want to learn a little bit about everything and then kind of everyone knew everything but they all were independent, or did they want to jigsaw that and everyone focused on one type of source of energy and then they taught other students about what it was they learned and produced a note that could go in a student duotang or notebook so that they could review. So I wasn't doing any of the teaching of what that content looked like. I was helping to facilitate for my students what they were going to be looking for and what structure questions they were going to answer, which provided them a bit of structure on what it is that they were going to learn. And it also allowed them to have that ownership, and it's their voice because it's their responsibility to teach the rest of class. Now, this isn't necessarily in a formal presentation style. This is more of a, you become the teacher and you teach. So I don't necessarily need them to stand up. They could choose how they wanted to present the information. One of my classes decided they're wholly doing PowerPoint on Google Slide type presentations. The other class is doing a variety of different ways that they're going to share their learning. So then their job is then to teach and supply their classmates with the notes and the summary of what it was that they learned. Now, in that context, I gave them the assessment criteria first. Then they did the learning and the research, and then the teaching happened last, and then we will reflect and connect and share and build knowledge together at the end. where we'll all have a big discussion sharing what it was that we learned. So again, it's flipped because I'm giving them the criteria for assessment, kind of the test questions. I'm giving them the test questions first. They're learning what they need to know so that they can answer those test questions. And then we're talking about the information and sharing them. So it does follow that flipped model in a really manageable, easy way to chunk that down. So I do have ideas about how I could carry this further into other strands. I haven't tested it, but looking at some of the tutorial videos, being able to leverage the vast amount of information and tutorial videos that are on YouTube are really a teacher's best friend. Having students going along at their own pace, learning the answers to their own questions, and covering way more curriculum in much faster time because you can be more responsive to individual student needs as opposed to the whole group where some students are left behind and other students zoom forward, sorry. So think about how you could flip your classroom. And it really just comes down to that one time. It could be 1 week that you start with using a flipped model. It could be one lesson you try it flipped. It's all about trying it first, testing out the waters, seeing how it works, and then getting it bigger and going bigger. And really looking at teachers who are doing different amazing things in their classroom. So taking the opportunity to go to teacher conferences and listen to other teachers talk. I had the very big privilege of going to the Rewired conference last week, and it was fantastic in a way that I got to see students and their teacher talk about some amazing things that they were doing. And it really invigorated me and inspired me to try new things and even to push myself further to try more things. And I can't wait once I've tried them out to be able to share them with you and share that knowledge in a new way with you who listen and watch every week. So that's what I have for you tonight. Thank you so much for joining me. If you want the links, I will actually post links to those two Google quizzes that I used. I'll post links to those. They'll be in the blog post that corresponds with tonight's episodes. If you do have any questions, feel free to throw them down in the live so that I can answer them. Or if you're watching this on the replay, feel free to put it in then as well, because I do answer them throughout the week when you do that. So this information, all of the things I shared tonight, including, I will even put a tutorial on how to make a Google form because they're out there, and put those up on the blog post that will go with this. And you can find that blog post at www.madlylearning.com. And if you need this show on the go, please head on over to iTunes to find the podcast replay of all of these episodes, which you can take and listen to it in the car on your drive to work with you so that you never miss an episode. Thank you very much for joining me, and I will see you next week. Next week, we are continuing our discussion on using tech in your classroom, and we're going to be talking a lot about how I use Google Classroom and all of the other Google Suite education software, including some more information on Google Forms. And we're going to talk about that all next week. So stay tuned. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you next Monday at 9 p.m. Have a great one. Bye.